What is up, guys? Welcome back to day 5, round 6 of the Vasilis Theodoridis International Chess Tournament here in Kavala, Greece. My name is Vasilis. I'm a Grandmaster, and I want to share my experiences and games with you from the event. So I drew my round 5 game against Grandmaster Sedlak Nikola after getting into trouble out of the opening in the early middle game. My opponent graciously took my draw offer, and I'm currently on 4 out of 5. But I'm already a full point behind Morgorg, who won all 5 of his games so far. So I definitely need to start playing better and then try to win some games in the next couple of rounds. And in round 6, I get a pretty good pairing in my opinion. I get paired up against a young Indian. I don't think he's titled yet, but he is over 2400, 2411 rating. His name is Sanket Chakravarty. I do have the black pieces, but I'm definitely looking to sort of try and pressure my opponent in every way possible on the board and win this game to try and close the gap between myself and the leader. I noticed my opponent only plays c4 on move 1. So when I first discovered this, I had sort of considered maybe trying to surprise him with something like e5, which I've never played. Basically in a tournament game, but I have some files and some information that, and with this being 1 round a day, you have plenty of time to sort of cook up something new. But I decided to stick with my usual guns because I actually found another file that I have on my computer that I've never tried before with the usual setup. But instead of the move that I used to favor, which is I think bishop e7, I believe, I wanted to try a new approach for me, which was knight bd7. And basically the idea is to try to wait and see for what your opponent is going to do in the next few moves. White always has the option of transposing back to some sort of a Queen's Gambit type structure, but already obviously his bishop is blocked in, and I'm not actually even obligated to play into a Slav, right? I could play, for example, for a c5 in 1 move somehow. So definitely this would be a preferred move order for black, as black is not committed yet to c6 and can play c5 in one move if he desires to do so. My opponent plays b3, which I kind of expected. So I had looked at this prior to the game: bishop d6, bishop b2, castles, and now there was 3 moves recommended in the file that I had, besides the obvious d4, obviously, which would again transpose to some sort of Queen's Gambit decline type of structure. The file contained rook c2, queen c2, and g3. And my opponent plays, I would say, what I would consider the main move, which is queen c2. And the file sort of mentioned that you should try to delay b6 for a little bit because of some tactical possibilities involving trades and then queen c6 ideas if the pawn was on b6 already. So knowing that, I decided to play a6. Obviously also knight b5 is already a threat, so a6 just makes a lot of sense. And again, here there were 2 sort of branches that my opponent could have chosen: bishop e2, the more positional line, and then rook g1 and trying to play for g4, the more aggressive sort of dynamic line. My opponent decides to play bishop e2, which again I kind of expected. Rook e8 is a nice prophylactic move, and now I was expecting my opponent to most likely castle, in which case I would have played b6, and there was a nice tactical justification now why my opponent can't go for queen c6, which is because of bishop b7 and queen b7, knight c5, and he can't take the knight because of a discovery on h2. So he would have to play queen c6 rather, and after knight b4, I guess, or knight c7, I thought it would also work, would trap my opponent's queen. So that was kind of the tactical justification, waiting for my opponent to castle and then only going for b6. My opponent still plays rook c1, and now I kind of had an option. I was at this point out of book, but I was still looking at b6. But the reason I rejected it was, again, because of the same sort of sequence, and I felt that after queen c6, bishop b7, queen b7, knight b4, the queen is trapped, and I'm threatening sort of a perpetual attack in the queen infinitely, but that would only give me a draw in this position, and I am currently a pawn down. So it would be, yeah, I'm a pawn down. Shouldn't I be a piece down? No, yeah, just a pawn down. So I rejected this. I also thought that maybe knight d4 was a move or some sort of knight move to vacate the queen retreat. But my opponent told me after the game that he knew this sort of perpetual line, which ends the game in a draw. And I mean, even if I could have forced a draw here, I definitely wanted to try and play the game out a little bit more to see if I could create more chances and potentially win the game. So after thinking for about maybe, I don't know, 10 to 15 minutes, I decided to take on c4 to try and imbalance the game a little bit and change the dynamic and the structure of the game, forcing my opponent more or less to capture with the pawn, because bishop c4 would run into b5, of course. And I try to play for e5, and my idea is basically to use this pawn sort of as a hammer and try to sort of hammer down on my opponent's position, putting the pawn on e4 and restricting my opponent's play. My opponent does what I expected. He plays knight g5, and here was the first sort of big misplay by me. I was considering the move knight c5, which is the best move, and I don't know why I rejected it. I felt like there was going to be something wrong tactically with my knight on f6 and potentially my opponent removing the knight and creating a big attack. By the way, let me go full screen real quick. I forgot to. There we go. And there we go. Okay, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen there, so I kind of wanted to play a little bit more solidly with h6, which I played in the game, but knight c5 was definitely preferred, as h6 kind of weakens the light squares a little bit around the king, and my opponent sort of wants to move to e4 anyway. So definitely knight c5 was sort of a missed opportunity by me to establish some sort of a coherent position and not weaken my light squares, and then my opponent would be forced to find some sort of a good move to try to keep the game close to balance. So h6 was definitely a big oversight on my part, and my opponent obviously plays knight g4, which he was planning to do anyway. I play bishop f8. I don't want to part with the pair of bishops just yet. My opponent castles, and I kind of started thinking that this position is getting slowly a little bit unpleasant for me, because my opponent can start playing for some f4 and try to open up the rook, and then the bishop is always looking, menacingly towards my king, and my opponent's pieces are pretty well placed. This knight on e4 is impossible to sort of kick out without further weakening my position with the pawn on f7. So I decided that it's time to sort of force some trades, and I decided to trade both of the knights. As we already discussed in the series and this tournament, you always have to trade your knights, because they are very bad pieces. And my opponent obliges, thankfully for me, and we reached this position after bishop c5, where my opponent sank into a fairly long think, about 15 to 20 minutes. And I believe that my opponent had basically two options in this position. One was to play for bishop d3 and try to again establish a nice little blockade on e4, which he already had with his knights, or to play for an immediate f4 and basically blasting open the position and immediately trying to create some sort of threats against my king. I believe the computer likes f4 more, which I thought was also the more critical move, but bishop d3 does look more sort of positional and stable, and I'm not really surprised my opponent played it at all. And here I also sank into a bit of a think. My first instinct was to play for queen g5 to try and get some sort of bishop h3 quick development to get my rooks connected on the a rank and get my bishop out of the way as soon as possible. Then I was considering also queen d6, which I felt maybe I could potentially try to force one of his attackers to be traded, and I also prevent with these both two moves I prevent the f4 move, because I would take, and if my opponent takes, queen f4 would be winning the rook, because his pawn is pinned. So I could have played one of those two moves, but after thinking for a bit, I decided that queen e7 made more sense, basically going back to my original idea, which was to push for e4 and sort of undermine my opponent's structure and these three pawns, actually these four pawns even. So my opponent is more or less forced to play bishop e4, c6, and now he kind of runs into a bit of a wall where it's hard to find a good move for white, because all of his pieces are kind of well placed. Structure-wise, he can't really do any sort of pawn breaks besides f4, which is what he eventually did. And I still have a couple of moves, for example, in my position left to consolidate my position, right? Develop the bishop somewhere, bring the rook to the d file, and then start pressuring the backward d2 pawn. So my opponent, tries to change the nature of the game, or keep the nature of the game rather, where he sort of has the initiative and plays f4. I of course have to take. Rook takes f4 and bishop d6, very important move, obviously, hitting the rook, and now the rook cannot go back without the bishop being hanging. So my opponent has to give a check on h7, king h8 only move basically, and then after rook f2, which was a bit of an inaccuracy, I thought rook e4 was a little bit more challenging. This bishop is basically always untouchable because my opponent would have some discoveries with the queen. So that bishop is more or less untouchable as long as it's there. And I thought this would be more critical. For example, after bishop b6, my opponent has, let's say bishop f5 options, rook f1 options, and the position is still a little bit unclear because the tension in the position remains. Whereas after rook f2, I felt like the tension of the position kind of diminished quite a bit. I managed to finish my development, and now my opponent blunders. It's not a big blunder, but it's still a blunder. He plays rook cf1, trying to bring all of his pieces to the attack, and of course now there's some threats, maybe even something as wild as rook f6 is a move to try just to grab that pawn on h6. Maybe something like I guess that is probably the most direct idea that white has. Maybe even bishop f5 could be an interesting idea to try and attack this pawn in the future after training the bishop on e6. So white definitely has some ideas to keep the attack going, but unfortunately it is my move, and a queen h4 is a nice double attack, basically threatening h2 and c4. And I thought the game was definitely shifting in my favor quite a bit, because I felt that the desperado that my opponent went for wasn't really strong enough. Bishop takes g7, and according to the computer it's not strong enough. It is still very close to equality. It's like 0.5 black advantage between a pawn advantage for black. So it's hard to determine how big exactly black's advantage is, how substantial it is, but I felt like that was not sufficient to sort of create full equality, and I was right. Bishop g7 was not good enough to create equality, because after king g7, queen b2 check, this is where I kind of rushed. Again, I felt my position was really good. I thought this was a desperado by my opponent that wasn't really going to accomplish anything. I should have played king f8, but after looking back at home with the computer a little bit and looking at some example lines, for example, g3, queen h5, queen b7, king g7, and bishop c2, bishop e7, queen c6, queen e5, only move to keep the advantage. It's 3 pawns for a piece. My king is a little bit weakened. My opponent's pieces are very, very well coordinated. My opponent has 2 passed pawns. And white is, of course, the one fighting for equality, but the position remains sort of very unclear, and it's definitely not a very clean piece for black in this situation. Of course, I should have still went for this. If you want to win games against opponents like this, you have to go into these positions where it's imbalanced, and anything can happen. Otherwise, the game will fizzle out into a draw, and that's exactly what happened in our game. I rushed a little bit with f6. Which was my initial idea, and I kind of just stuck to it, and it wasn't a good idea because my opponent plays g3, an important move, forces my queen back. Queen b7 check is one of the moves, not the only one, but definitely good enough. I decided to play bishop e7, and after rook f6, I basically have nothing better than just forcing a repetition of the queen with rook a b8, rook a8. And the draw was agreed. So a bit of a disappointing finish there. I definitely had some chances, and even if the position, let's say, would be even less of an advantage for black, let's say it would be 0.2 or 0.3 even, or even if it was completely equal, it's completely imbalanced, and anything can happen, and the game goes on. Whereas after f6, the position very quickly fizzles out into a draw, and it doesn't really help my tournament chances whatsoever. So 3 draws in a row, a little bit sort of stagnant. Definitely a better game than the previous 2, or the previous 3 even, but still not the desired result, not the desired outcome. Still need to play a little bit better to create more problems for my opponents. But we still have 3 rounds to go, and a friend of mine and I were talking, I remember, and we always said, we reached a conclusion that if you win the first 3 games of the tournament, and if you win the last 3 games of the tournament, you're probably going to have a really good tournament. So if I manage to win the last 3 games, I still have everything in my hands, basically. Gotta just improve the quality, focus up a little bit more. And tomorrow should be a big game with the white pieces, hopefully. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you at tomorrow's recap of Game 7.